and welcome to this week's episode on Voice for Good. And today's guest, I have Adam Cox. Now, Adam Cox is a bit of a legend, and if you want to know more about him, just read the bio, because I want to get straight to it. Adam, tell me a little bit right now how you're using your voice for good.
Yeah, great. Pleasure to be on your show. For me, I use my voice as part of my mission to kind of change the world using my voice, and I do that in different ways. So I'm a radio presenter. I have a radio show on Share Radio, which is called Modern Mindset, which is also one of my podcasts. I have a second podcast called The Hypnotist. So I have real hypnosis sessions that are me working with clients, and then people that might have a similar kind of issue can actually hear that session so they can benefit from my hypnosis. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist. So, obviously the key tool there that I use is my voice. So without that, it wouldn't really work. And hopefully I'm doing some good there because, they're paying me quite a bit of money to make a change. So hopefully I'm helping them to create the kind of change that they would want. And also I speak on stages or at online conferences to try and create some kind of value, mainly based on topics like anxiety or personal change or wealth. So that tends to be how I use my voice to hopefully create a bit of good in the world.
Brilliant. Love it. So tell us a bit more about your mission. You have a mission. I think a very specific mission, haven't you? So do you want to tell us a bit more about your mission?
Yeah, the mission for me is that I want to impact more than 1 million lives using my voice. So what I figured out is that as a clinical hypnotherapist, I'm fairly limited at the ability to scale that because clinical hypnotherapists typically work one-on-one. And obviously it's going to take a long time, physically impossible to change 1 million lives that way. I also do workshops. So that way I can do group hypnosis sessions. So you can have maybe 40, 50 people in a room, sometimes 100 people in a room at that point. So that gets me closer to that 1 million target. But what I found is that clinical hypnosis enables me to use the podcast platform and things like YouTube in a different way to scale much more people in a shorter period of time. So, these days I'm getting about 500 downloads a day of people listening to my hypnosis sessions. And my goal is over the next year to get that to over 10,000 people a day, which, then genuinely means I'm impacting a lot more lives through the clinical hypnosis that I do.
Brilliant. So tell us, this season's all about the talk that made you. So what do you feel was that one talk where you arrived and everything changed for you? Not just because of that talk, because you and I know the hard work comes leading up to that talk, but when you delivered that talk, tell us about the talk that made you.
Yeah, for me, it was doing a talk called The Psychology of Fear. And I think for me, why that was so important was as a teenager, late teens, I was absolutely crippled by fear and anxiety to the extent that I was a recluse for around about 6-7 months. I wouldn't leave my flat unless it was kind of dusk, and even then it was just to go to the supermarket, get food, and then go back to a tiny 1-bedroom flat.
Wow.
So for me, because anxiety was that detrimental to my life, now when I talk about the psychology of fear, people see me as quite confident. I've got my fingers in lots of different pies. I kind of regularly in quite public or high profile kind of situations. And it became such a significant talk for me because I was the evidence in many ways to the people in the room that were also dealing with anxiety or crippled by fear that change is possible. And the talk itself has lots of examples about how quickly you can go from a state of anxiety into courage, fascination, confidence. And weirdly, one of my most intense fears was the fear of other people. It was social anxiety. So I had a fear of public speaking. So getting to a stage now where I speak regularly is kind of weird. I'm reminded every time I do it that there was a point in my life where speaking in front of 3 or 4 people would give me like those rashes over my face to my chest, and I'd just be in bits about it. So for me, talking about fear and also knowing that I've gotten through my own fears is for me, that's, of all the talks that I do, that's the most profound one because it reminds me of the journey that I've gone through, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think was different once you did that talk that made you in terms of your business, in terms of your profile? What had changed for you once you did that talk?
I think for me, it was about genuinely me demonstrating my credentials as not just a clinical hypnotherapist, but as someone that had dealt with fears and anxieties, and at that point had a track record of helping hundreds of people smash through lifelong phobias. You know, people that had genuine life-changing results as a result of the work that I did. And then I was taking all of that experience, putting it into a talk with the sole intention of creating a belief change in the audience that this fear or anxiety wasn't something I had to live with forever. It's possible to change. And I think for me, not only did that change how I considered my role genuinely of a position of serving people, but equally it was a reminder that I myself had gone through that journey. And I think the nature of what happens with people is that we forget the progress that we've made. So for me, why that was such a significant talk is that it reminded me of the progress that I'd made, that I'd kind of taken for granted, because you don't really sometimes sit down and think, wow, I'm a very different person now to who I was before. And that talk really, you know, kind of was the evidence of that.
Right. Just for the listeners, if you're hearing babies crying in the background, just for disclosure, I'm recording this while we're kind of in lockdown still. So you might hear my co-workers, as we call them, the creative director and sales director. One is 6 months old and one is three years old in the background. So if you're hearing that, that's just the reality of the situation when I'm recording this podcast. So back to you, Adam. Tell us, what do you feel? I mean, there's probably not one, but what do you feel was the biggest obstacle you overcame to get to that point where you can stand there and use your voice for good?
I think for me, what I had to overcome was fear initially. I remember when I was 24 years old, I'd faced a lot of my fears. At that point, I no longer had this kind of general anxiety disorder. I'd gotten over a lot of the social anxiety disorder. I had a business, but it was still a one-man band at that point. I was turning over about
Was that
$500,000 a year. It was a PR agency, yeah. So I set a PR agency up when I was 23 years old. At the age of 24, it was still small, but it had reasonably good turnover for basically a one-man band. It was approaching 500,000 a year. And I did a young enterprise competition when I was in sixth form. So I was maybe, I don't know, 16, 17 years old, which got to the national finals. And back then I was this very shy, introverted person. But because they knew that I was now running a business and I'd reached a previous national finals, they invited me to speak on stage at the national finals. And at this point, I still had my phobia of speaking in public. I still had huge amounts of self-doubt and anxiety. And they said, right, it's going to be at the national finals. It's going to be at the Savoy Hotel. There's going to be an audience of about 500 people. Would you like to do it? And at this point, I kind of knew intuitively that the only way I could face these fears is by doing the thing that I feared most. Right. So I said yes, like in a split second. And they said, great, you know, it's in about 2 weeks' time. And I had this absolute crippling fear of speaking in front of 10 people. And I thought, how the hell am I going to do it in front of 500 people? But I did it, and I kind of practiced and I rehearsed it. And a lot of the techniques I now use with people in terms of hypnosis and NLP techniques, I was using on myself, getting myself in a very confident state. But of course I still had nerves, and there I am, you know, one of these kind of, you know, round tables, you know, about to go on stage, and people around the table, they're saying, oh, you know, are you speaking later? Because they saw me on the itinerary. Yeah. And I said, yes. And they said, well, you look very confident. And inside I'm thinking, you know, I'm really not. And they said, where are your notes? And I said, well, I don't have any notes. You know, I'd mind mapped the whole thing. I had brilliant. the whole thing kind of structured. So I wouldn't be, you know, a slave. I wouldn't be hiding behind the notes. And it was weird because it increased the amount of pressure on me, because I was just straight after the Rugby World Cup winning captain of the time. You know, England won the Rugby World Cup in, I think, 2003. There it was, like 2004, literally, you know, there I was straight after him. So the expectations of the audience were quite high, because they've got this really charismatic kind of guy.
Was it Lawrence Delalio?
It wasn't, no, it was the other one.
Martin Lawrence.
Martin Lawrence, that's it.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So straight after him, and then just before the chairman of HSBC, they had really high caliber speakers. And then not only had I not really spoken before, but I had this kind of anxiety about speaking in public, literally no practice because I'd avoided it my whole life. And I did that speech, and to make things worse, they dug up an old picture of me from when I was 17 years old, getting to the national finals, of this kind of frizzy hair afro, big thick glasses. And they were kind of saying, well, look at this guy, he's transformed. And I thought, well, I haven't transformed anywhere near where I want to. So they kind of piled the pressure on. And I did the talk, and it wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I did a talk really about how the audience was all these kind of 16, 17-year-olds. And I said, look, you might think that it's a job or university as a choice, but really, self-employment is also an option. And I just kind of talked about my experience of being an entrepreneur, starting early, and the fact that when you start early, there is less pressure on you because you don't have any dependents, you don't have a mortgage. You can play that game of snakes and ladders, lose, and still start in a stronger position because of what you've learned. And I just did a talk about that. And I got such good feedback from it. Lots of people just saying, well done, that was really inspirational. And in many ways, that talk changed my life, perhaps even more so than the one on the psychology of fear, because it was the first proper talk that I did. And it was me facing fear at the same time. And now what I learned from that is that it's very hard to go from speaking, to 500 people with, very, high profile people in the audiences, to then feel nervous about speaking in front of 10 or 15 people, on a topic that you're very knowledgeable about. So, for me, that was the biggest thing that I had to face, was my own fear. And now, that's a huge reference point for me, because once you have faced that, the world opens up. And I certainly wouldn't be a professional speaker, speaking as a part of my income stream now. That wouldn't have been possible if back when I was 23, 24 years old, I didn't say yes to that opportunity. And because I did, it changed my life in a different trajectory.
Brilliant. Must have been really rewarding. And also the caliber of people you're around must have been quite inspiring. And I mean, I just think of myself next to those guys, and I just look like this scrawny, tiny guy. So I was like, oh my God, I think I'd be quite intimidated just by their physical presence, not of my ability to deliver on stage. I'd be like, there's some big people you had in the room. So awesome. So just on that note, what would you quickly say to someone who is in that situation right now, and they're like, do I say yes? Do I say no? Like, they need to confront their fear. Obviously, this is what you do. So what's the one piece of wisdom, if we're sitting around a campfire right now, you would impart on them?
Yeah, I would say you've got to, where there is a lack of experience, you have to rely on faith. And one belief system that I've always had is that humans are capable of way more than we ever give them credit for. So on the basis that that is true, you should say yes to a lot more things than you're currently saying yes to, on the basis that if you really have to step up and deliver, actually, you will rise to the occasion. You will unlock the resources. And I kind of liken it a bit to epigenetics, in the sense that, there are lots of things in nature that are only activated when it's required. So a seed doesn't start sprouting unless there's water. There's certain animals that, activate latent genes when they're in certain situations. Like there's certain breeds of animals, for example, that will reproduce entirely on their own if they have to. And I kind of feel like as humans, we've got this crazy amount of capacity that we don't really tap into. So the only thing that you can really tap into that is by saying yes to things which are way outside your comfort zone, relying on the human ability to adapt to those situations. And I think, if I was offering one bit of advice around a campfire, it is, trust that you can rise to the occasion. And two things are going to happen. Either you are going to rise to the occasion, in which case that becomes evidence that you can do it, or you're going to learn crucial lessons that are going to be invaluable to you, to your future. So whatever happens, you're going to come out winning just by saying yes to these opportunities. And certainly that served me quite well.
Some excellent wisdom advice there. If only Trump hadn't said yes to the rising to an occasion, but that's a different podcast. We won't go there right now. So let me just go to, like, we do a little bit of devil's advocacy here. I just like to play a little being a devil's advocate. So, and I'm sure you come across this all the time. I myself, I've studied cognitive behavioral hypnotherapy a few years ago. Obviously, I've done NLP, EFT. I was a coach myself. I don't coach anymore now. So I just wanna switch sides and be like, Adam, can you really change lifetime habits really quickly? Like, can you really do this? That's my question.
I mean, my experience is that you can, but it requires the right kind of circumstances. And the way that neural pathways work are that generally, you know, most of what humans do is unconscious. So we don't really think about blinking or breathing or walking or talking. Most people listening to that drive has had the experience of driving very long distances completely on autopilot. They're just daydreaming. So we can do a lot on autopilot. And the reason we can do that is because the neural pathways exist. And when they exist, you don't need cognitive, mindful thought to make the things happen. They can just happen all by themselves. So, you know, these neural pathways are there, and it tends to be a combination of repetition and emotional intensity that kind of create those neural pathways. So when we think of flashbulb memory syndrome, for example, you can memorize a particular day, you know, where you were when, you know, the 9/11 towers went down, the trade towers went down, or Princess Diana died, or Michael Jackson died. And you can remember where you are because there's an element of emotional intensity linked to a specific occasion. So the way in which you can change lifelong habits isn't by repetition. You know, this idea that it takes 21 days to change a habit. Well, you know, that, where did that figure come from? You know, it's based on a lack of emotional intensity. And the example I used at how quickly change can take place. As a teenager, I used to love eating apple turnovers. You know, when my friends were eating chocolates and crisps, that was my go-to thing. And I could eat like 4 or 5 of these a day completely on autopilot. And I remember biting into one summer. I was on holiday, and as I bite into it, there was a crunch where there shouldn't have been a crunch. And I look in and I can see half a wasp wriggling. I can feel the other half in my mouth. And at that point, what should have been the emotion of pleasure, or at least like a neutral association, was then high, like 10 out of 10 levels of disgust. And at that point, you know, suddenly the emotional association to this automatic habit had changed to the extent that, you know, since then, it's not that I've never had an apple turnover, but I can't eat them on autopilot like I do before. It has to be a real conscious, deliberate effort. So that habit changed within seconds. And that wasn't any hypnosis or NLP techniques. It was simply linking a highly intense negative emotion to a behavior. And in that moment, everything changed. Now, as a hypnotherapist, I do things like that deliberately, change those patterns, but not on a random, you know, basis. Reverse engineer it. What is a useful outcome? What is a useful belief? What is a replacement behavior that you would want? So for me, I know that change can happen in a decision, you know, in one new association. So it's now me doing that deliberately to create change for other people.
So would you say, if someone was highly skeptical, it's just like, would you put your time into convincing them, or would you like, look, a bit like you said, say yes, and then if it doesn't work for you, at least you know it doesn't work?
Yeah, I kind of do the opposite. And I say, well, look, you know, you've spent however much time, you know, trying to deal with this thing yourself. Okay. How is that working for you? Because what I want them to do, if they already had if the locus of control was already within them, if they already had the strategies and techniques to break whatever they're breaking or to change whatever they're doing, why are they seeing me? Why are they even calling me? So what I want to do is to create an element of a need for that particular thing. And then it's a case of saying, right, well, you know, and normally anecdotes I find are very useful to demonstrate and say, look, I don't know about your experience, but I met someone who had this particular issue. And I normally mirror back the exact kind of situation. And having worked with a few hundred clients, you know, I can find enough anecdotes that mirror the experience or perceptions or belief of the individual I'm working with and say, well, look, not about you, but they had this issue and I worked in this way and now they don't have that issue anymore. And I think that's more convincing than trying to sell someone, because people already know that, you know, people that are good at influence and sales, they're going to be self-serving at some level. So I kind of neutralize that and say, look, I might not be the right person to work with, but these people that I've worked with that had this situation, I helped them. And this is the way in which I helped them. And that creates an element of a convincer. strategy. And plus, like, having hundreds of testimonials kind of helps, because that's kind of a proof point in itself.
Yeah. And you work with some fairly famous people, which I'm sure you're not allowed to disclose. And I'm sure that helps too, right? Because the social proof aspect testimonials. Plus, I work with, I don't know if you are allowed to name, I'm not going to ask you to, but generally, if you're allowed to name drop, that always helps.
Yeah, I mean, the intro to my podcast, says that, I work with celebrity CEOs and royalty. Now, the truth is, the royalty that I've worked with hasn't been UK royalty. It's been royalty from different countries. The nature of what I do is that, confidentiality is kind of very high on, as you would imagine, the list of values. But there's been a few celebrities that I've worked with that have been more than happy to give endorsement. There was a lady who was reality TV star, a few million, people on Instagram, wanted to be a singer, but had a phobia of singing in public based on a traumatic event in her school. Her first opportunity to sing in front of an audience, and there was some giggling, kind of school bullies mocking her. Yeah. And that gave her a lifelong phobia of performing in public. In a single session working with her, she then, within 7-8 months was performing to an average audience of about 10 million on Celebrity X Factor.
Is that who I think it is? Is it the person who won?
No, it wasn't. No, unfortunately, it would have been great for my CV if it was. It was a group made of former Love Islanders.
Yes.
And she got,
not because I watched her or anything.
No, but I mean, they did all right, and but mainly, it was great because she couldn't sing in front of 4 people, and then she's singing in front of 10 million people. Her name's Zara McDermott, and yeah. She was very kind enough to kind of go on, her Instagram stories and kind of say she was working with me as a hypnotherapist and things like that. And it got various, national media coverage. So those kind of things are helpful if, you say, well, look, you might not trust, but just kind of Google my name and see what comes up. And then that kind of helps.
That helps. Yeah. Brilliant. And it sounds like you really, truly are using your voice for good. So my last question for you is, what's next for you, Adam? I know you want to get your downloads to 10,000 a day. Was it a month? A day. What's beyond that? What's next?
Yeah. For me, I feel like clinical hypnosis, hasn't really evolved and been made accessible in the way that other kind of things are. So for me, what I want to do is kind of innovate and evolve clinical hypnosis to genuinely be able to maximize it. So one of the things, yes, I want to grow my podcast, but I've actually, got plans in place to develop a TV show format called The Hypnotist, where people can actually see me working with people go through incredible transformations very quickly. Because I think that the key barrier that most hypnotherapists face are that people don't believe that change can happen. So if, there's a TV show where I can literally, prove that, you can literally, almost like magic, turn someone from a crippling problem and then no longer have that problem. It's very hard for people to say, yeah, that can't happen when they're seeing it episode after episode. So that's my big goal at the moment, to create a TV show where this change is just, seen and witnessed.
I know you're going to go through kind of the social media route of YouTube and stuff like that. You're going to get funding and get it onto kind of like mainstream media.
Yeah.
You're going to start one and build to the other.
Yeah, for me, I know someone that is actually that works in one of these kind of, purely her job is to come up with new TV show formats. And literally what she said to me, she said, like, if I pitch this to production companies right now, they could easily steal the format and kind of change it ever so slightly, to not be, in breach of kind of IP rules. So for me, 2 key things, really. I've got to build my profile. If you stopped 100 people on the street and said, like, name a hypnotherapist, they're not going to name me currently. So I've got some work to do in terms of building my profile. And probably the way in which I'm going to do that is my podcasts and probably having this TV show on YouTube initially, do it in a particular way where it kind of builds a social following. And then I've got the right kind of ammunition to go to a production company and say, look, I can do this much bigger on a bigger budget, and then, probably aim to retain the worldwide rights of that, but kind of because it's a format that could work in any country. So that's a big goal for me at the moment. But you've got to go through the right process, because people are lazy and they will steal good ideas if they can.
Even if they're not lazy, people will steal ideas if they can, right? Brilliant, Adam. Thank you so much for coming on the Voice for Good podcast. Where can people hear about you? Do you want to just give away your details, and so people can contact you directly if they have any questions or want to find out more, or maybe fund your new TV show?
Yeah, totally. So my standard website is adamcox.co.uk. If you want to hear my podcast, just go on any podcast platform and put in The Hypnotist. You can also find, if you put Adam Cox in Spotify or Apple Music, you can hear my hypnosis tracks there. If you have a phobia, you can go to phobiaguru.com. If you are overweight and don't want to be overweight, you can go to hypnoslimming.com. And if you have an addiction and don't want an addiction anymore, you can go to addictionexperts.co.uk.
Fabulous. And we'll list those, of course, in the description. Thank you very much again for coming today. And for all the listeners, I will always end how I always end, which is be seen, be heard, and always use your voice for good. And we will see you, hear you, and can't think of the next thing to say. Be in touch soon. Enjoy yourselves. Bye.